There we go.
There we
I
are.
made the countdown do the thing. Hello.
Welcome. Hello, everyone.
How is
Welcome
everyone
to the
doing?
stream.
We're so prepared and so ready to start this professionally, as we always do.
You know what was really fascinating to me, by the way? I'll jump in. During the countdown, at the beginning, the music is faster, and then it slows down. And as the music slows down, my brain felt like time slowed down. The countdown seemed to go slower as the music slowed down.
And how much weed have you had prior to that? I'm just kidding.
As we well know, none.
That's fair. That is very fair. Cool. So we are here chatting with, well, I guess, Father. Why don't you introduce yourself? Because I feel weird saying...
You don't know how to pronounce my last name? Or what's the problem?
We've been working on it.
DeMatteis.
I heard it was DeMatteis.
That's actually what Google does. If you look
I was going to say
Google is always DeMatteis. You can't find it unless you ask Google DeMatteis. J.M. DeMatteis is sitting here with his daughter and her daughter's fiance and my old pal Zeki.
Sure, they go way back. They've actually known each other longer than Katie's known her own father.
We must go back at least 25 minutes.
Yep.
And why are you here?
What?
Well,
That's
I mean,
profound question, Kate.
Why are you on this earth?
I am. This is going well so far. Why am I here? I'm here to talk to you because you have this show that you do, and you're my daughter, and I love you. And
no, that's what I meant is, who are you in the context of why would we even want to talk to you outside of being my father? That's the question that I'm asking.
There's actually no reason whatsoever.
Do you need another reason?
No, she will not talk to me unless I tell her all my achievements of the day, and then she'll talk to me. Oh, we're here essentially because I'm a writer, as you perhaps know, Katie, and I've been working as a professional writer for more than 40 years now. A lot of work in the comic book business, TV live action animation. I've written prose and all kinds of things, and here I sit today to talk to you about my new Kickstarter,
which is very exciting. And I know I am very familiar with what the Kickstarter is, but what is this Kickstarter that you speak of?
What is this Kickstarter that you speak of? Ben, thank you for chiming in with these profound questions. I've been so moved by everything you've had to say so far. The Kickstarter. Okay, so I've been doing this, as I said, for a really, really long time. And one of the things that I've done in terms of my comic book work is I've always balanced out my work for Marvel and DC, working on those established characters. For those don't know, Spider-Man, Justice League, Batman, Superman, Captain America, Doctor Strange, all those guys I've written over the years. But I balance that with what we call creator-owned work, stories of my own creation, going back to the 1980s when I did Moonshadow, which was my first big creator-owned work. So I go back and forth between that, and I'm always looking for new venues for my creator-owned work. And one of the things I've been interested in recent years was Kickstarter, because what fascinates me about Kickstarter is the fact that it's kind of just what you're doing right now. It's a direct pipeline to the audience. There's no publisher in between. The reason I resisted doing a Kickstarter up till now was based on everything that I know. Aside from the creative work, there is so much work that goes into it, both in the preparation and then, as I'm seeing, during the 30 days that Kickstarter is running. And I know myself and I know my nervous system, and doing it alone, I would have had a nervous breakdown. But I am lucky enough to be working with my friend David Baldy, who is a TV writer and producer of many years' experience, also a huge comic book fan. And we got to talking about this, and David said, well, let's do this together. And he built this new imprint, Spellbound Comics. And when we started out, I thought we'd be kickstarting one miniseries, a 5-issue miniseries. But as we were talking, I pitched him 4 different ideas, and what David said was, well, let's do all 4 of them. So what we're doing is launching 4 brand new projects, 4 first issues. Think of them as TV pilots. 4 first issues with 4 phenomenal artists, 4 of my favorite artists. And it's really, really exciting. And one of the most fun parts is that we launched these 4 issues. Everyone who who contributes to the Kickstarter buys all 4 issues or the collected edition that we're going to put out, which has the 4 stories in them along with a lot of other extras, will get to vote on which of the 4 will be the first to continue. So the audience is a participant in this.
That's really cool.
Which is really exciting.
I guess I have a question, but I also want to make sure that other people get to ask questions as well. And I actually don't know the answer to this. So these 4 stories, were these things that had been kicking around in your head for a while that you had just sort of been sitting on and waiting to see when the time was right? Or was this like, okay, we're going to do this Kickstarter, let me start noodling and thinking and creating?
No, all these, when you're a freelance writer, what you're constantly doing is coming up with new ideas, constantly. Sometimes you come up with an idea and a week later you sell it. Sometimes you come up with an idea, and I've literally had this happen, and 25 years later you sell it, or you almost sell it 3 times, and then you don't sell it and you finally do. So these are all ideas that I've been toying with, 2 or 3 of them for 10 to 12 years. One of them goes back, 15, 16 years that I've been developing. And so what happens is you pitch it, you don't manage to sell it, you take it back, you fiddle around with it, you put it away for a while, take it out a year later, you start to fiddle with it again, you pitch it again, maybe you don't sell it again, back and forth. One of the projects we actually did, we had it all set up until the contracts arrived, and we looked at the contracts and went, there were some things in the contracts that we couldn't sign, so we had to put it away again. One of the interesting things about people don't realize, even about the most successful people, say, I'll speak to writers specifically, is the freelance life, 40, 50% of the freelance life, no matter how successful you are, is about rejection. It just is. You can look at someone and all you see is the stuff that's out there, the stuff that's succeeded. You don't see the things that have been pitched and bounced, or the projects that got out there, then crashed and burned. And so what you really need to do this job is a hard head and a fierce will, because as I said, as I know from experience, sometimes it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years for an idea to get out in the world. So all of these have been ideas that I've been nursing. So it's so exciting to get all 4 of them out at the same time, simultaneously. The other great thing is that each of these 4 books, we have 4 superstar artists providing alternate covers. So you have the main cover by the main artist, plus the alternate covers by guys like J.H. Williams III and Kevin McGuire, who I worked with on Justice League International, Dustin Yen. For the collected edition, we have Liam Sharp, just an amazing, brilliant artist, and more to come. And so it's in 40 years of doing this, is one of the most exciting things I've ever done, honestly.
We actually have a question in chat. Where do you get your inspiration from? And I think it's probably going to be a more nuanced answer than just from right here, but maybe just like for these 4 stories, or even one of these 4 stories, if you want to maybe go a little bit into.
Oh, that would be a good way to do it, because I would say
Yeah.
you would know the answer to that is from laying on the floor, staring into space and not listening to anybody else while my brain is spinning around. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll tell you, one of the ideas is called Wisdom. It's a supernatural Western. And when I was a kid, Westerns were the thing. I looked this up recently. When I was like 6 or 7 years old, first of all, there were only 3 networks, right? 3 major networks. On those 3 major networks, 27 shows were Westerns. Wow. Amazing. Not to mention the movies and everything else. And I was also obsessed with the Alamo when I was a kid. There was this book called Remember the Alamo that I would take out of the library, read it, bring it back, wait a week, go back to the library, take it out, read it, bring it back. So Westerns were like embedded in my consciousness. And then as I grew up and grew older, I really kind of forgot about it. There would be the rare Western that popped along that I might be a little interested in, but for the most part was not a genre that interested me. And this is where the ideas come from. One morning I'm laying in bed, my eyes closed, just woke up. And the way ideas come to me, they tend to come to me as movies. So I'm laying in bed and suddenly I see this movie. And there's guys on horses. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, it's a Western. And I keep watching it, and I watch it's a supernatural Western. And you watch this stuff unfold, and then I run to the computer and write this stuff down as fast as I can. And you wish sometimes, I don't know if I'd wish for this actually, that you could jack right into your head and jack that into the computer and just have those visions in your head come out. But I'm not ready to plug anything into my head, so I take that back. But it's always, there's always this gap between that pure thing that you see in your head and the thing that you get down on paper. It's an interesting phenomenon. So that's how Wisdom came to me. it's sort of my one-liner on that one is Deadwood meets Lord of the Rings. So it's a very gritty, personal Western about a guy whose wife and child have been taken by these dark forces, and his desperate need to get them back. But he's also a sorcerer in the Old West who's been tasked with saving the world from this great evil. So you have a big cosmic threat happening, and there's a very, very personal quest going on in that story. And the art for that is by a wonderful artist named Tom Mandrake, who is known both for his ability to do the supernatural and for his Western work. So it was a no-brainer to put him on this, and he did just an extraordinary job, some of the best work of his career.
I think that's actually the one that I am the most excited for, if I'm completely honest.
Yeah, is it because of the genre, because of the art? I'm curious.
The art is what immediately grabbed my attention, but once I, kind of saw the art, it then reminded me of similar things that have inspired my own efforts creatively, like the Dark Tower series with Roland the Gunslinger.
Mhm.
Like I saw the gunslinger on that art in particular, and I was like, oh, this is probably going to be the one that resonates with me the most. But that's my bias with liking Stephen King novels and
Right.
and all
It's
that
funny
kind of
because
stuff.
people ask me which one do you like the best, and honestly, it's whichever one I'm thinking about at the moment. The other thing is that all of these stories are really massive stories. They're big stories. So Wisdom, the hope is, yes, we'll do the first 5-issue miniseries if that's the one that gets the votes. But in my head, there's at least 2 more 5-issue miniseries to follow before this whole giant story is told. And it kind of works that way with all of these stories.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I have to say, I think it is so funny that you said that thing about plugging your brain into a machine and having it create the story for you, because I am not kidding you. The last 4 or 5 nights as I've been going to sleep, I've been having these story ideas, and all I've wanted to do is plug my brain into something that could go in and extract the stories out. So that was very bizarre to hear you say that out loud, as I've been feeling that aggressively over the last.
But that's
days.
the beauty of this stuff. I really I say this, and I don't say this jokingly. I believe there's a dimension of story out there. And these stories, I actually have to write a story about the stories one day. It's like the stories are out there floating around, and they're looking for the right vehicle to tell them. And maybe they have a choice of 10 different writers. Maybe it's him, and then they kind of zoom in through the door in your unconscious, and they come through, and then every writer has a filter. The filter is our experiences. It's our point of view. It's our obsessions. It's the things we think about, care about. So then this story sort of merges with our point of view, and we merge with the story, and then it becomes this unique thing. And then, of course, the even cooler part is once you start telling the story itself and the characters take on a life of their own, and they are not in my control. I always say the story is like a horse. You get on the horse and you have a goal. You say, I'm going 6 miles north. And you get on the horse and you start riding, and the horse starts immediately pulling off, wants to go in another direction. But you go, no, that's my destination is down there. And you go and you go and you go. And the horse pulls off again. And that you always have a choice. Do I try to force the horse to go where I want to go? Or do I follow the horse? And the answer is always to follow the horse. You have to follow the stories. You have to follow the characters, because they know far better than you do what they're supposed to be doing. And it enters a realm where it's really sort of mystical, and it enters some other dimensional space. And that's what I love about it. When my story rears up like that horse and surprises me, then I know I'm onto something. If I'm just controlling something and putting the pieces down, then it's not fun. When the story rears up and surprises me, that's the beauty of what I do.
Love that.
I have a question sort of along that vein, but is maybe a little bit more niche. In terms of, that initial, when you have that initial sequence of images, or, maybe it's almost like cut scenes or something like that. When you then rush to sort of jot that down, how fleshed out is it? Is it more just sort of like a general description of the things that you saw, or are you trying to be more specific than that?
It depends. It really, really depends. You want to get down what you saw in your head. And sometimes that's a couple of pages. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's a paragraph. Sometimes it's 10 pages, depending on how long that movie was that you saw in your head. Sometimes it's just, sometimes it's just a scene. remember years ago I was working on one of the animated shows I was working for, and I got to the end of one act, and I couldn't quite get the next act. I wasn't quite sure how to start it. And Katie, I had to go pick you up at ballet or something like that. And I was driving in the car. And as I'm driving in the car, and what's interesting too is that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about time. In like a split second, I watched an entire scene sort of, it was like in a bubble, and it unfolded in my head. Dialogue, action, everything. And it happened in about a second. And there was the whole scene that I then went home and inserted into the story. So it depends. And then sometimes you get these things and you write them down and you put them away, and you may not look at them again for 10 years. And then to me, it's like, the story, The Shoemaker and the Elves.
Yeah.
It's like when I pull it out again, it's like, did I really write this? I know there's a story on my computer or in that drawer, and it's a really cool story. And sometimes like, I don't really remember writing this, but I think I did. And it's like a gift. And then you take that and you flesh it out and you play with it.
That is incredibly cool.
Yeah. So you're asked where the ideas for these 4 came from. So I'll tell you the next one. The next one is called Layla in the Lands of After, with art by an extraordinary artist named Sean McManus. Sean and I together. Sean is known for working on Sandman and with Neil Gaiman, and Swamp Thing with Alan Moore. He and I at DC some years back did a 2-year run on Dr. Fate. That's one of my favorite things that I've ever done. He's just a master, and he's one of those guys. He's been doing this for 35 years, and he just gets better and better. He's at the peak of his form right now. And this is a very, very rich, almost Oz-like fantasy, and it really requires someone like Sean to bring it to life. It's a story. So where did the idea come from? The idea came from 2 things. My fascination with death and the afterlife, which I've been obsessed with since I'm 4 years old. And I've read, through so many different mystical traditions, and from my own thoughts about it, different views, different ideas about the afterlife. I've formed my own. And my other lifelong obsession, which is Oz. Loved the movie when I was a kid, as both my children will testify. I read all the Oz books to both of them. Love those books. The thing that always bugged me about the movie, though, is at the end of the movie, Dorothy wakes up and they all say, it's just a dream. And when you're a kid and as an adult, I'm like, no, it's not. It's not a dream. I just watched it. It really happened. So the theory I evolved about 10 or 12 years ago, remember in the beginning, Dorothy gets smashed in the head with the window?
Yeah.
That's how Well,
Yeah.
Dorothy obviously was seriously injured. She's like in a coma, having a near-death experience. And so Oz, that was her afterlife experience. Now I get it. So I came up with this story about a 13-year-old girl named Layla. She's riding home on her bicycle one night, and she's enveloped in this brilliant light that carries her off through the sky, over the rainbow, through the looking glass, and she lands in this magical world. And she's just overwhelmed with the trees that can talk and rivers that sing. And then all of a sudden this cat comes trotting along, and it's her cat that died like 5 years ago. And then she encounters her grandfather, who's also dead. And then she realizes that she's also dead. And that light that enveloped her was the light of the car that ran her down while she was on her bicycle. So she decides, though, I'm only 13 years old. I have my whole life ahead of me. I refuse to be dead. So they decide, along with the help of another character called the Not Quite Fallen Angel, to see if they can find a way out of the afterlands and get her back home. Now, the reason they're afterlands and not the lands of after and not the land of after is that my idea is that when you die, you get the heaven that you project. So every soul, it's interacting. This place is made of imagination. So every soul creates the afterlife that they expect. If you expect angels and harps and clouds, you'll get that. If you're some, guilt-ridden Catholic, you'll get hell and devils punishing you for all your sins. If your idea of a great time is to be 10 years old again, playing stickball in the street with your friends, you'll get that. And on and on and on and on, and many lands beyond those. So she has to travel through many, many lands in this attempt to get back home and be alive again. So that's Layla in the Lands of After.
That's very
the second
cool.
one. Yeah. Let's see. Yes.
We have a question in chat, which is not directly related to the Kickstarter.
That's okay.
But Ash asked if you have time, she would love to hear anything about Spectre as a vehicle for Hal Jordan's redemption.
All right, we'll finish up the Kickstarter and I'll talk about Spectre. Spectre is one of my favorite gigs ever. I loved working on that book. I'll do it. I'll do a diversion and do it now. Um, Spectre, sometimes even when you're working on these established DC and Marvel characters, you're given the freedom to make them completely your own, and they become almost like creator-owned books. And Spectre, like Dr. Fate, the series I did with Sean McManus, is one of those books where I was able, you get to pour. It's you look for the stories where they provide a framework for you to pour everything you think and feel, all your thoughts and feelings about life, the universe, and everything into these stories. I read a quote years ago, and I thought it was by Ray Bradbury, but I've never been able to track it down. So maybe I imagined it, maybe I made it up. I don't know. But the basic idea was, whatever story you're working on, just that, fill it, write it as if it's the only story you'll ever write, and fill it with all your passions, all your concerns, all the themes that obsess you. And Spectre was a series where I did that. The story, for those that don't know comics, there's a character named Hal Jordan who was Green Lantern. He did some terrible things in the comics, and he was condemned to hell. And then he was given a chance to come back as this being called the Spectre. Now, the Spectre had existed for years, since the 40s, and he was like the spirit of God's vengeance, and he would do things like turn into a giant cheese grater and grate the bad guys to death,
So dark.
Yes. Some of those stories, especially like some of the old stories from like the 70s, were really, really, really intense and dark. But the idea here, they said, hey, Hal Jordan's going to become the Spectre. Do you want to write it? And I said, I don't want to write it if he's a giant cheese grater guy. But if this is the story of Hal's journey to redemption, then I want to write it. So that's what it was about. That's what they wanted to do. So it became Hal's journey to find his way back from the abyss to a place where he can redeem himself, and along with himself, try to redeem the world as well. And though, if anyone that knows my work, you'll find that theme running through many of my stories, if not most of them. The search, certain themes, the search for redemption, the search for meaning, whether it's psychological, emotional, or spiritual. Who are we versus who we think we are? What is reality versus what reality is? These are all themes that work through all my work. And what a clever transition to Godsend, because those themes really. I hope that answered your question, and if not, ask again if you want to know more. Godsend is just about that. It's about who am I versus who am I really versus who we believe we are. And I think a lot of us go through life. My vision of who we are, I think we come into the world with a really set, an authentic self. And what happens is, once we're released into the wild, two things can happen. We can be in situations that allow us to express that authentic self and grow into that authentic self. Or we could grow into situations when especially people grow up in abusive households and really have difficult childhoods, where the image I have, which I used in a story years ago, is like you have shit poured all over you. And then that shit hardens around you, and you walk around believing that that's actually you, this cone of hardened shit. This is who I am. And then the spiritual journey of your life, when you finally realize that that's not you, is peeling that off you to find that authentic self underneath. So, and I feel the same way about reality. We have the reality that we're told this is what the world is. So CNN is telling us every day, this is what the world is. I use CNN as a cipher for all the media, which is banging at us with all this darkness and negativity constantly. And there's that, I call that the skin of the world, and what's underneath that? So Godsend is the story of a guy named Eric Small. He's a 35-year-old junior high school teacher. He's depressed. He's overweight. He's had an abusive childhood. He's really struggling. He's got like one friend. He's got a crush on this teacher at school, but he can never really talk to her. Into this world appears this celestial being called God, that the media dubs Godsend. No one really knows where he came from, what he is. They think that is he some like Messiah figure? Is he here to destroy us all? No one is really sure. But Eric becomes obsessed with him. If you guys have ever seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Richard Dreyfuss becomes obsessed with the UFOs. It takes over his whole life. That's what happens with Eric and Godsend. And there's some connection there, and he can't figure out what it is. And then one day, into his living room appears a 7-foot-tall giant turtle being with a man's head who says, "Get on my back. Get on my back." And what are you going to do when a 7-foot turtle appears in your room? If he says, get on your back, you get on his back, flies him out the window. And this begins an event that shreds apart Eric's concept of who and what he is and who and what reality is. And it goes from there. And this is one of those stories, where like, I know the first issue is really good and there's great stuff happening, beautiful artwork by my friend Matthew Dow Smith. But I know what's coming too. So I'm done with the first story in my head. I have so many more stories to tell. And Godsend is another one that's going to be in my head, at least 3 5-issue miniseries. And along the way, we'll be introducing maybe dozens of new characters. So it's another very exciting story.
Very cool. I guess, do you want to talk about the 4th book? I feel like you've touched on the other 3, so
Yes.
may as well.
Yes, the 4th
dig
one.
in there
I
as
see
well.
the title right over your shoulder, Katie. Any Man.
Oh, wait, wrong way. There we
No,
go.
wrong way. There we go. Okay. So Eddie Man, first of all, the art for Eddie Man is by David Baldion. David and I just recently did a series for Marvel called Ben Reilly Spider-Man. David is a phenomenal artist. All these guys are phenomenal artists. I can't say enough good things about all of them. They're not just good artists. To be a great comic book artist, just being able to draw well isn't enough. You have to be able to tell a visual story. You need to be able to tell a story from panel to panel and page to page. And that is a very, very unique skill. I've seen guys who can really, really draw, but they cannot tell a story worth a damn. So it's an extraordinary skill, and all of these guys are masters at it. So Any Man is the closest to a traditional superhero story in that starts, and this too is a very big story because it takes place over the course of 50 years. It starts in 1969 in Times Square, where a portal opens. And through the portal comes this costumed figure who says that he is from millions of years in the past, from an ancient civilization, an idyllic civilization, a perfect civilization that basically grew too big for its own britches. Their hubris and their reach exceeded their grasp, as the cliche goes, and it brought the whole civilization down. He says, I'm here now because this is a crisis point, the late 60s in your time, and I'm here to help you avoid the fate that befell my people millions of years in the past. And the world eventually accepts him, and he becomes this global hero known as Any Man. He's like, he's the Superman figure, if you want to put it that way. The hero of heroes, the pure, but not just for one city or one country, but for the world. The only problem is that entire story that he's told the world is a complete concoction. It's a total lie. So the question becomes then, who is this guy? Why is he really here? What's his agenda? Who created him? And that's just the first twist of several twists as we could dive deeper and deeper into this story. And it's going to take place between 1969 and 2019. I hope I didn't insult Katie.
She's like profoundly upset right now. She'll be okay though. We'll just give her a couple minutes.
And so it takes place over the course of 50 years as we explore Any Man and the mythology around him and this group of characters around him. And that's Any Man. And that one has an alternate cover. Those of you who know my work and know my work with Keith Giffen on Justice League International, Kevin McGuire, our phenomenal artist from that series, has done the alternate cover for that, which we just released to the world today.
I was actually just going to your Twitter to pull that up. I'm going to link to that tweet because it's a really cool cover.
It's a great cover, yeah.
Very, very, very cool. So let me grab the link for that right now.
And while you're doing that, the cover for Layla is by J.H. Williams III, which people know from his work with Alan Moore on Promethea, one of the most amazing artists out there. Dustin Yen is doing the cover for Wisdom. We haven't gotten that in yet, but when we do, we will share it with the world. And then we have a fourth mystery artist who will be doing the cover for Godsend. And as I mentioned, Liam Sharp, brilliant Liam Sharp, who I worked with at Marvel on Man-Thing years ago, is doing the cover for the collected edition. Hello, Katie.
Hello, I'm back.
That's good. Well, we're all done talking about anything.
I could still hear you.
You could. Okay, good.
Oh, there's another question. Valor would like to know, do you still utilize the Marvel method when plotting out your stories? I don't know what that means, but you might.
Could you do sort of two things? Could you answer maybe one, what is the Marvel method for those of us that are unfamiliar? And then two.
I'm going to explain. I'll explain. But you can't answer the question without explaining it.
It's like you've done this before or something. It's crazy.
Yeah. So there's two basic ways that comics are written, and there's a lot of permutations between these two ways. You can bend each one and stretch it in different directions, especially depending on your relationship with your artist. There's what's known as the Marvel method. Now, the Marvel method was originally popularized by Stan Lee back in the 60s when he was working with guys like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. But the Marvel method then was like, they would have a quick conversation, or he would write a couple of paragraphs. Jack Kirby, genius of all time, would go off and create 22 pages of story based on a one-liner sometimes not based on anything. The artwork would go back to Stan. Stan would, was the editor, and he would do the final dialogue and build on the story that way, which is a whole interesting thing. But as it evolved, Marvel method in my time, as I know it, I write a very, very detailed plot. Page by page, panel by panel, usually angle by angle, lots of dialogue, the themes, everything all laid out. But the beauty of the Marvel method is then it goes to the artist. Then I get the artwork back. Then I put in the final dialogue. Yes, I've got dialogue in the plot, but until you see that artwork and react to it, it opens up a whole other door. And I've had situations where it's a famous story that I did in Spider-Man where the character of Harry Osborn died at the end. And in my head, when I mapped this thing out, I was working with a brilliant artist named Sal Buscema. I knew I was going to have to really purple prose it at the end, really sell this ending, and tug on everyone's heartstrings and hit them over the head, And I got Sal's artwork back, and I started to dialogue it, and I looked and I went, every single thing I asked for in my plot is there in the artwork. And if you look at the last 3 pages of that story, there's not a word on those pages because I didn't need to, because everything I put in the plot and more was there in Sal's art. Conversely, the downside of Marvel method is sometimes you get that artwork back and it doesn't get anywhere near what you're trying to communicate. And I've had situations where, happily not a lot, where like I'm turning the artwork around sometimes, trying to figure out what's going on the page. And you got to figure out how to get your story through this art that is not really serving the story that you wrote. But I find the Marvel method is really exhilarating. But I also love the other method, which is how I learned in the first place at DC, which is called full script, which is basically that page by page, panel by panel, angle by angle, captions, dialogue, everything. You're pacing the story exactly how you want it. And when you're done, it goes off to the artist, and that's the end of it for you. I mean, obviously you get to look at it and tweak it, but basically the work is completely done in the script. But even there, I always say, comics is about chemistry across the board. The writer, the artist, if there's an inker, colorist, letterer, every piece of that puzzle has to be right. I could give that same script to 5 different people, and one way or another, you're going to get 5 different stories back, because the way they choose to tell that story visually, even if I'm describing every angle and every panel, it'll still be different because every artist has a different vision. And that's what you want. That's why on all these books that we're doing for the Spellbound Comics Kickstarter, all the artists are credited as co-creators, because even though I've been carrying these ideas around in my head for years, until that art brings that story alive, that story is not alive. Until that artist interprets the story, until they create those characters in a way that we can visually relate to. So I've had stories that I've worked on for years and years and years and years, and you see it one way in your head, and then you find the right artist, and it transcends the vision in your own head. So they're all co-creators on this, and I hope that explained the difference between Marvel method and full script. And do I work? I work both ways.
Hey, sorry.
And I know I had the same dumb thought. And in fact, with these books, Godsend and Wisdom were written full script. Any Man and Layla were done plot. I call it plot first. People call it Marvel method, but I call it plot first. So I enjoy bouncing back and forth between the two. It gives me each one exercises my brain in different ways.
I was going to ask, do you have a preference between the two, or do you like having that sort of interplay between having to think about it one way and then switching things up?
Yeah, I do like that. I have to do, the magic of comics for me to this day, and I've been doing it a long time, and I've been reading comics as long as I knew how to read. There's something about that moment when the artwork appears. Whether it's a full script or a plot first, when that artwork comes in, I am a 10-year-old kid again, laying on my living room floor reading a comic book, and my jaw drops and my eyes widen in wonder. And which is why I have so much admiration for the artists that can do this. Because when I was a kid, that's what I spent most of my childhood drawing, and my first goal in life was to be an artist. So I have great, great admiration for the guys that can do this and do it well.
Cool. I guess to kind of follow up with that, then, since you've been studying the craft since you were 10, uh, what kind of research would you say you do whenever you're kind of entering into like an established like canon? You know, like how do you flex your own creative muscles while still either, doing like a callback or,
Right. No, it's a great question.
staying within like the boundaries and that
That's
kind of stuff.
exactly it. And that's the challenge. Because, when I first started in the business, whenever I would get a new assignment, it was a great excuse like, oh, you're writing Aquaman now. I better go buy the past 5 years of Aquaman back issues and read every one. It was a great excuse to just, expand my comic book collection. Plus, obviously I got to see what other writers and artists had done with the books. I don't do that anymore. Now, the art, if I need to know something, Marvel or DC will send me digital files of the books that I need to read. Or a lot of times when I've worked on these animated films, they want to adapt a particular story or it's a character I don't know that much about. So they'll send me a bunch of stuff. I'll read through it. And what you want to do is try to find your way to the core of the character. You have to respect the history. You can't break the character. And with a lot of these superhero characters, I look at it this way. It's almost like it's a cage. There's just so far you could push outward before you break it, and it's not the same character anymore. But you can always dig deeper. You can always go down and dig deep. And for me, the digging deep, I always imagine the way I approach characters, and I always write character first. I write from the characters out 99% of the time. You got to cut off the top of their heads, get your flashlight out, and start rooting around in their psyche and find some corner of that psyche that hasn't been explored before, and find something fresh and new and original to say about that character, even if they've been around for 70 or 80 years. And if you can't do that, then maybe it's not the right gig for you. And because these characters, as I was talking about before, these characters become real. I get to know them, and I've said this half jokingly, but it's really true. Like, I know Peter Parker better than I know many of my friends. Why? Because the Peter Parker that I write, I know his every thought and feeling. I know every little bug crawling around the corner of his brain. I don't know every bug crawling around the corner of anyone else's brain, but I know Peter's. And the other interesting thing is, another writer has a very different Peter Parker, because we're merging with these characters. We're merging our psyches with their psyches, and it becomes a third thing. So it's a very intimate experience with these characters. You get to know them. I've written so much Spider-Man stuff over the years that both Peter Parker and Ben Reilly they're like two of my best pals. I know them. So when I did this Ben Reilly series recently, I hadn't really written Ben Reilly for years. And it was sort of like when you see an old friend, like, Ben, how you doing? Let's go out to dinner. Let's catch up. What have you been up to? Well, let me go write that down. It's a very intimate experience. And, to the outside world, maybe a little crazy. But I remember, I think I spoke to one of your classes too once, and I know Katie, and I spoke to one of Cody's classes when he was little. And I remember telling the class, I get paid to lay on the floor and stare into space and make things up. And you could see the kids in the class like, how do I get that job? I don't tell them about the days when I'm banging my head against the wall and screaming at the gods, But the essence of what we do is that it's like entering into this imaginal space where that which we call imagination and that which we call real sort of meet and combine and become a third thing.
That's very cool. I do see a question in chat. I did really quickly want to circle back to something you said earlier, which was about how all the artists are co-creators with you. And I think that's really interesting that, it is a story being told by multiple people. I'm curious, how does the editor fit into that sort of duo trio? Like, how are they a co-creator? Are they helping to sort of massage the plot and like keep the train on the rails? What is your experience with that?
It depends on the editor. It depends on the project. When you're dealing with these pre-existing characters, it's exactly what you said. They're there to keep the train on the tracks. If I say, what if Peter Parker becomes a serial killer and goes and kills 47? No, Peter will not do that. You cannot tell that story. What the editor ultimately is for you, a good editor, is a sounding board. The best editor knows, in my experience, when to leave you the hell alone to tell your story. And they also know when to step in when you're going off the rails or when you need help. And working on these pre-existing characters, sometimes what the editor will do is like, oh, what about this villain? I know you're really good with figuring out the motivations of villains. Here's this guy. Write a story about this guy. They'll throw out a suggestion, or I'll come back and I'll say, I'm stuck on this part. Let's talk about it a little bit. And usually in 5 minutes, we'll figure it out. Most of the time on creator-owned stuff, 90% of the time, I'm my own editor. And what you see on the page is what I wrote. The great thing about these the multiverse books is I'm working with David Baldy, who is a writer with 20 years experience. So he's there to look over my scripts. And if he gives me some feedback, I'm talking to a writer who's been around for 20 years doing work. And I don't have to listen to him, but I do. And if what he has to say resonates, I will go and make that change because I trust him, But in general, most of the creator-owned stuff I've done, I've basically been my own editor. And even the amazing thing is I've been so lucky, even on a lot of, Marvel and DC stuff, like what you see on the page is what I wrote. And that's it, And other times, thank God you have that editor there to say, here, this is not working. And when you have the editor that leaves you alone, it's a 4-issue series. And for 3 issues, you're just left alone to do what you want. And the 4th issue comes along and they pick up the phone and they say, this is really not working. You listen and you listen to what they have to say. And the minute I hang up the phone, I'm sitting down and I'm fixing that, whatever it is. And then, writing for animation and television and is a very, very different thing because a comic book creation is a very intimate thing. The main creation is between the writer, the artist, and the editor overseeing that. And then, of course, you have the colorist and the letterer, who are very, very important. I mean, I could do 20 minutes just on how important the letterer is and the colorist. They're very important. But the main body of creating that story comes from the writer and the artist, with the editor overseeing that. In TV or in film, some of these animated films, I've been on the phone with like 4, 5, 6 people, and everybody's throwing in ideas, and that can be overwhelming, And my job then is to, especially if you're writing for a TV show, so I'm just a freelance writer. The TV show, they've got a season mapped out. They know what they want to do. They have certain stories they want to hit, and they call you up and they say, for the episode we want you to write, we want this, 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 and this to happen. So it's not like I'm coming in pitching them the idea. They have the basic idea. So my challenge is it's a 2-pronged thing. I have to give them what they want. At the same time, I have to bring as much of myself and my unique perspective to the table to make that story unique, or else why would they ever hire you again if all you're going to do is regurgitate what they're giving you, So it's an interesting balance. You have to meet their needs and please them, but the way to really please them is to kind of transcend their needs and bring more to the table than what's already there. But it's fun. I really like it. Like 99% of what I've done animation-wise has been with Warner Brothers Animation. And all those guys from Alan Burnett to James Tucker to Jim Krieg, Bruce Timm, all these guys, they're writers. They know story. So, to get on the phone with those guys and sit for an hour and a half and just bat story around, as we're a lot of the animated movies that I've done have been based on pre-existing stories. And the challenge has been to how do you pull this story apart, put it back together into a 90-minute animated feature, stay true to the essence of the story and bring something new to it, and it's to work with these guys who know stories so well. To me, it's fun because I spend most of my time, as I like to say, alone in my room playing with my imaginary friends. So it's great to have a group of people sometimes to talk to and bounce these things around with.
That's very
Did that
cool.
answer the question that we started with?
I think it did.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we hit on Monk's question, which is actually, it's very interesting. It's, what is the best story not being told? What kind of stories draw you in that you want to write, but maybe haven't, whether it's time, money, job? And then Monk goes on to talk about a spaghetti Western that has been, bouncing around in his idea for a while, but he hasn't had the time to think of it. So I think.
Well, that goes back to what I was saying before. I've had so many of these ideas for years. I truly believe, as I said before, that stories are alive and they have their own timing. There's my timing and there's the story's timing. My timing is, I want to tell this now. I want to get this out now. The story's timing might be 5 years from now. And during those 5 years, you're running into walls and that wall pushes you off into another direction. You hit another wall and that pushes you off another direction. So by the time that story is ready, it's in a place it never was when you first thought you wanted to get it out into the world. In terms of stories I haven't told that I want to tell, I've been really, really lucky in that I've told so many different, I've, done autobiographical comics. I've done psychological superheroes. I've done, my creator-owned work, which is usually, involves spirituality and mysticism. Keith Giffen and I are known for our our humorous take on superheroes. I've done kid-friendly fantasy. I've written novels. I've written, all these things. So what's the story I haven't told? It's probably the next story that comes into my head when I wake up tomorrow. If there's one thing that I would love to do that I haven't gotten to do, my favorite TV series of all time is The Twilight Zone. I would love to do either an actual TV show or maybe a podcast, just nice little 30-minute Twilight Zone supernatural thrillers, standalone stories. And I think I would just, let me write 20 of those. I'll be really, really happy.
I think it is worth noting that you did write for the Twilight Zone in the 80s.
I did. That was the very first TV sale that I made, was for the 80s version of the Twilight Zone. And when I started in comics, actually, they used to have these books. They were anthology comics. They weren't allowed to call them horror comics. They called them mystery books, but they were horror comics. And you would write, 6 to 8 page Twilight Zone stories with a twist ending. But in 8 pages, it was a great way to learn, because in 8 pages you had to have a beginning, a middle, and end, a character arc, a good plot, flip the ending, and get it all done in 6 or 8 pages. It was a great, great way to learn the craft. But to be able to expand out with that and do something Twilight Zone-ish, that would be great. That would be really great. I would love to do that.
I definitely want to ask about your novella. However,
Yes.
there's another.
Oh, there's a good transition, because the novella is very Twilight Zone-y. But
I was going to say, there's another question in chat that I think that you will like, so I do want to make sure to ask it. Is it hard to balance the hero with the villain, making them defeatable but challenging? And I think you're going to have a very interesting response to that, knowing you.
In a lot of ways, for me, the villains are even easier to write in some ways. I'm fascinated with the villains, because when I teach my writing classes, I have this class, Imagination 101, that I teach periodically, not regularly, but with regular irregularity. How's that? And one of the things I talk to the class about is, I call it the big why, to understand any character, but it's especially essential when you're writing villains. Why do they do that? It's not because I'm bad and evil and I want to rule the world. Maybe there's one character out of 1,000 that really is completely, totally evil. But even a character like the Red Skull, when I wrote Captain America, I did a backstory on him and really dived in there to try to understand him. I want to know the motivation. Kraven's Last Hunt is a very famous Spider-Man story that I did. And before that story, in my mind, Kraven was like not my favorite Spider-Man character at all. In fact, I always thought he was kind of ridiculous. He wore these leopard skin pedal pushers and he chased Spider-Man around and tried to hunt him. And so the question I asked was, why do you do that? What'd your mother do to you that you feel this need to chase Spider-Man around and kill him? And it opened up this whole door onto this character and an understanding of him. And, the interesting thing is, and I only realized this recently, in trying to understand these characters, especially the villains, it cultivates compassion. Because if you could look at Dr. Doom with compassion, then you can look at the people in your life with compassion. Because the villain of the story doesn't think of himself as a villain. He's just a guy trying to do what he thinks is the thing he needs to do to survive in this world. Maybe even he thinks he's making the world a better place by doing it. So by getting into their psyches and really, really, really understanding them, they're not villains anymore. They may be damaged people, but they're not villains. They're human beings. And then if we take that perception into our lives, because we're all, look at the world we live in today, so polarized, and it's so easy to dismiss other people as, screwed up, or they're evil, or they're this or they're that. But what made them that way? What is at their core that's vulnerable, And that's the stuff that always fascinates me. Just the same with the heroes. You want to poke into the dark corners, because nobody's all good either. And I'm realizing, as I'm saying this, I'm remembering this is a theme that's been in my work since I started, when I was doing those 8-page stories, always looking for the light in the dark and the dark in the light as a way to understand people.
I love that so much. I think that not only is that a lesson in how to create a compelling villain, it's also, I don't even think that you realize, if you're not someone who is embedded in story and as a writer, how much easier it is to relate to those types of stories. And I know that there is sort of a tendency to go, well, the big bad is evil because they're just evil and that's what they do, and evil does bad things. Right. But it makes it a lot more relatable to just the general audience when you have a rationale and understanding, and there's some sort of empathy that is created between you
to feel for the villain, even as you oppose what he stands for. to understand what brought him
Absolutely.
to that place in his life. Yeah, yeah. It's like the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna and Arjuna are going into battle, but the whole idea is that you have to go into battle with compassion, with love for the force that you're
Mm.
opposing. Well, this is not an easy thing to do, but if we could do that 1/10 in our lives, with the people that are on the other side of the equation from us, that's an incredible thing, you know?
And I think and you can tell me if I'm wrong because I'm not a professional writer, but I think that there's this sort of perceived dichotomy between a hero and a villain where it's like they are at opposite ends of the spectrum and like they have to be oppositional in every way. And I almost think in some ways it's more of I don't know if symbiotic is the right word, but the relationship doesn't have to just be there's dark and there's light.
Right. Right. Because there's not, because the dark character has light and the light character has dark. One
Yeah.
of my favorite stories I did when I was writing Spectacular Spider-Man over the course of 2 years, Harry Osborn, who's Peter's best friend, becomes the Green Goblin. So the Green Goblin is Spider-Man's deadly enemy, and he's trying to destroy him. But Peter and Harry love each other, even as they're opposing each other. Well, you can't ask for more of a story, that kind of tension between two people who love each other and are destroying each other at the same time. And that story writes itself. And you see into the psyches of both of them and you feel for both of them. And ultimately, every once in a while, it's fun to have a villain who's just pure evil and you want to hiss at him and, throw a rock at him. But once in a while, otherwise, after a while, that gets boring. You really, really, you want to be able to relate to everybody in the story. You want to hook into everyone. And the more you feel for the villain, the more you understand the villain, the more invested you are in the story. As for my novella.
Yeah, I was about to say, let's get into it.
Yeah. We're talking about the Twilight Zone, and this is the kind of stories that I really, really love are the stories of ordinary people in the real world, and then something happens and it takes a little twist, and you suddenly realize that the universe is bigger, weirder, stranger, and more miraculous than you ever dreamed. So I hadn't done any prose since about 2010 or so. I had a novel that came out, a young adult fantasy called Imaginalis, and this is the first prose I've done since then. And I'll give you the premise of the story. And this is just the premise because it jumps off from there. Woman's sleeping, her husband's sleeping beside her, wakes up one morning. She's had a terrible migraine the night before. She's a little foggy. And she looks and there's a kid standing at the end of her bed. For a second, she feels like she's still dreaming. Like, who, what? Then she realizes, no, I'm not dreaming. There's this kid at the end of her bed that she's never seen before in her life. And then this kid starts crawling into the bed with her. And she freaks out. She grabs the kid and she throws him on the floor. Her husband sits up. What's going on here? And the kid starts to cry and looks at her husband and goes, Daddy, why did mommy do that? Well, this kid is her son. And she has absolutely no memory that he ever existed. She remembers her husband. She remembers her daughter. She remembers every single detail of her life, but she has no memory of her son. Let's take mommy to the hospital. Something's very wrong here. They run it down. Does she have a stroke? What's going on? They run all these tests. She seems to be fine. Maybe it's stress. Maybe it's this. They take her home. She gets a text message on her phone. If you want the memories of your son returned, we need $250,000. If you don't respond within the next 24 hours, we'll take the memories of your daughter next. So basically, her mind has been hacked and her memories are being held for ransom. But that's just the first step in a story that gets much bigger and twistier from there. And just what we're talking about, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, all these questions get twisted and inverted along the way. And by the end, I think it's not just a very spooky story. It's a great story for Halloween, but it's also a very human story about parents and children and loss and grief and hope and all those good things. It's called The Excavator. You can get it as either an ebook or a physical book on Amazon. The ebook is really cheap. I think it's just $1. And the physical book is more expensive, but it's got 10 beautiful illustrations by a wonderful Greek artist named Vasilis Gaidzilis.
There's a question about him in chat, so that's perfect.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Just as can you tell us
very,
about
very,
it?
very proud of this story. But what was the question?
The question is just, can you tell us about the artist?
Oh, the artist, yes. So here's an interesting story about how Vasilis and I met. My son Cody, Katie's brother, was working at a comic book company out in LA some years back, and Vasilis was doing some work for them, and asked Cody, "Oh, is that your father? Oh, I'm a big fan of your dad. Could you put us together?" And we got to chatting, and I was working on a story. It goes back to all the things we're talking about. And I had this image in my head. The story was called The Adventures of Augusta Wind. And I had this image of a girl almost in Victorian garb with an umbrella standing in front of a ruined castle. So Vasilis sends me this sketchbook of his. And in the sketchbook, I come across a picture of a girl in Victorian garb with an umbrella standing in front of a ruined castle. And I immediately emailed him and said, you have to draw this story. And he did. And we did 2 volumes of that for IDW, The Adventures of Augusta Wind and The Adventures of Augusta Wind, The Last Story. But that's how Vasilis and I met. We've worked on other things together over the years. We have a new project that we're developing right now. And he's just one of the most, talk about amazing, one of the fastest, most creative human beings. He works in so many different styles, from like very realistic paintings to the most surreal out there artwork and everything in between. He's really, really very talented. He did 10 paintings for the Excavator. And I think one of the advantages of the print book is that you can really sit with them in a way that maybe you can't on an ebook. Although I'm a big fan of ebooks, so whichever you'd like to buy, it's okay with me. But he's hugely talented. He's done a beautiful job with the 10 illustrations for the Excavator.
Yeah, those images are just so beautiful. I remember when Ben and I first saw them, I think we'd asked if we could get one printed up to hang in the house, just because it's so evocative and beautiful and moving. I know we're coming up close to the hour mark, but I do want to ask you, since I know we have a lot of aspiring writers here in chat, if you could give 1 or 2 pieces of advice to people who want to become writers or want to get published or just want to make a great story, what would that be? And I know those are kind of different questions, but see if you can wrap them up into one.
There's a lot in there. The first thing I'll say is it's not an easy life. It's a great life, but sometimes it's not an easy life. You know, especially if you're a freelancer, there doesn't matter how successful you are. The arc is always like, whoa, and then it steadies up for a while. Then, oh, well, this is not always going to be this way. And then down it goes again. So you need, and plus, as I was saying before, especially in the beginning, you encounter a lot of rejection. You have to have a really hard head and a really thick skin and a really fierce will. You have to believe in yourself more than anyone else. I've seen people, you know, Katie, you know, when you were doing theater growing up, I saw so many incredibly talented people. You'd look at the stage of a high school musical and you would go, I can't believe how good that person is. They should be on Broadway. But not everybody gets to Broadway because talent is only part of it. Sometimes I think talent is, you know, especially in the beginning, is a smaller part of it than that fierce will and that hard head, because you have to be able to bang your head against those walls over and over again. And then you get rejected and you go crawl under your desk and you cry and you curse God and you get out and you write the next story. And you keep doing that until that wall breaks and you get through. So that's really important. So, you know, so there are people that have great talent and they just don't have the nervous system for a creative life. You know, they'll go and do it, you know, on their own, and that's fine. If you want to just write stories by yourself, that's great. And the other part was, it's a cliche, but it's, in my experience, and I can only speak for myself, the absolute truth. You know, Joseph Campbell has that old phrase, follow your bliss.
Yes.
Find the thing that excites you. Find the thing that sets your soul on fire. And if the thing that sets your soul on fire is writing or art or theater or music or whatever it is, you have to follow that dream. But what I always add is it may not lead you where you expect to go, but it will always lead you someplace good. It's like that horse I was talking about. Your dream is that horse. That way, I'm going to be an Academy Award-winning actor. And the horse is pulling you off this way. And it turns out you end up teaching theater. And you have a more incredible experience teaching theater than you ever would have had you become a professional actor. But you still followed that passion in your life. I've worked in animation. I never had a remote interest really in working in animation. I stumbled into it backwards because I was just following that path of my dreams. I want to be a writer. I want to write comics. I want to write this. I want to write that. And then through those connections, these opportunities, doors just open randomly sometimes. And your choice is, I could walk through that door or not. Well, do I really want to write animation? It was never a dream of mine. Let me give that a try. Well, that turned into a 20+ year career for me, and so satisfying that I could, I've loved working in the animation field. So you have to be, so that's the third bit of advice. be open to the surprises that the universe throws you, because there's always going to be surprises along the way. Follow that horse, follow your bliss, and believe in yourself.
And just for fun, because I know that this can be, sorry, Zachy, I didn't mean to take away from that
No,
moment
no.
for you.
Totally fine.
But I'm just thinking, I know that so many people feel like, you know, where they're at in their life currently, they couldn't possibly pivot. What was your first job?
My first job?
Yeah.
I never really had real jobs. I had a few along the way. You know, before I was a writer, I was, excuse me, my voice is starting to go. Before I was a writer, I played in rock and roll bands. So dream number one was to be a rock and roll star, you know? And then I transitioned into rock and roll journalism, and then into writing comics. And one thing, you know, I used to do temp jobs sometimes, horrible temp jobs. And I'm not proud of this, but I couldn't stand it. I couldn't bear it. There were times I would get a temp job that would last 2 days. And by 3 p.m. on day 2, I'd have to leave because I couldn't take it. And again, I'm not proud of that. But it's because I knew what I wanted to do. And the idea of being locked away for 8 hours, doing something I did not want to do, was torture for me. But a lot of people don't have that choice. I'm lucky. You know, I'm lucky that I managed to do that. Some people can't. I admire the hell out of people that they go to an 8-hour job and they come home and they work on their novel and then they sell their novel. That's phenomenal. It's because they are on fire for that thing. You know, so I had a lot of dumb jobs. I worked in a bookstore for a while, you know, got fired because we had a gig with our band and we left, and they said, you can't leave or you're fired. And we went, well, we got to go play the gig, and we left and we got fired. So, you know, the real world jobs that I had were not much to speak of, as those that knew me then could attest.
But I think that's important. It's important that you worked those sort of like random gig type things, because you have to start somewhere and you have to make money somehow. And I think especially now in the world that we live in today, like, people have to take money jobs, and sometimes they suck. Yeah.
You know, in those days I could play in a band and maybe, you know, my share might be, you know, $50 for the gig, and do 3-4 gigs in a week. And that was enough money for my share of the rent and some pizza, and I was doing okay. But it's a different world now, you know. Also, when you're young, you can sacrifice more things that way. You know, when I started in comics, my page rate, if I look at it now, was really low. It probably wasn't bad for then, but it was like, but I didn't care. I didn't even care that they were paying me. That was just a bonus. I didn't even care that they were printing the stories. They were letting me write these stories. And I was working with an editor who was teaching me how to write a comic. You know, that was the great thing. And then they paid me, and then they printed it, and then it turned into a career. Wow, that's amazing.
I love that. All right. So now that we are kind of wrapping up, where can people find you? Your Twitter, your Instagram? The Kickstarter has been posted ad nauseum in chat, but I will post it one more time.
The thing about Kickstarter, I just want to say is it's the old cliche, we can't do it without you. With Kickstarter, we literally can't do it without you. So anyone out there who has enjoyed and appreciated my work, come along with us on this ride, because it's really, really exciting. And I can't wait to see these books out in the world. So you can find me on Twitter at JMDeMatteis. You can find me on Facebook at JMDeMatteis. You can find me on Instagram at jm.dematteis. Very important to put that dot between the JM and the DeMatteis. And my website has the shocking URL of jmdematteis.com.
Also, I just want to say we are super close to breaking 40K on the Kickstarter right now. I'm just checking the updates. So if you could help us do that today.
Let me see. Let me check it.
We're like a couple $100 bucks.
Before we started, we hadn't even broken 39,000. Now we're 39,000, almost 350.
Well, my hope for you tonight is that we reach 40K before the end of the evening. And if you would like to help that would be fantastic.
Well, if you're thousands of listeners.
Okay, that feels rude. Mean.
Unreasonably rude.
Chat, you have to tag like 20 of your friends.
You have thousands of listeners. That's the only reason I'm talking to you.
I never claimed to have thousands of viewers, but
chat, go multiply real quick.
Don't tell our chat to go multiply. That feels problematic.
Multiply safely.
This was fun. No. Katie, next time we'll have to get your brother and your mother, and we'll all talk.
Just have a family stream.
Just a family chat.
A family chat for the world to see.
But in all seriousness, this has been really lovely to have you and to chat to you. And people in chat are saying that they're going to retweet. That's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for your support.
So yeah, support the Kickstarter, buy the excavator, follow my father on all of the social medias, and Papa, just thank you so much. It's been really nice to chat to you. Zeki, Ben, if you have
Yes,
any
we'll have to
final.
talk again sometime.
We don't talk between streams. No relationship outside of this.
We only talk when we're live.
But Ben and Zeki, I don't know if you have any parting words or thoughts.
I mean, I have more questions, but we could just circle back. We could just do this another time.
We might have to do a part 2 at some point.
This
maybe.
this seems like a great start to something that we can follow into.
Yeah.
Now that I know that you also enjoyed Joseph Campbell.
All right.
Guys,
Well, thank you so much, everyone. For anyone who wants to, we will be back in about an hour streaming a raid in World of Warcraft. My father will not be there, unfortunately. I don't think we could get him to play WoW if we paid him for it. He came in to watch me once. The one time you watched me play WoW, you said, "I don't understand this," and walked away. So glowing reviews all around. But yeah, we'll be back in about an hour with some video games. And until then, please just, follow the Kickstarter, stay up to date with it. I think it's going to be really, really incredible. And thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Papa, again for being willing to chat.
Yeah, Mark, thanks for coming and hanging out with us. This is really cool.
Yeah, thanks, Jam.
Okay.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
Ciao,
Bye,
everybody.